I want to tell you about the kind of town where the same car has been parked outside the hardware store since before you were old enough to notice cars. Not abandoned, not broken down, just parked there, every morning, every evening, as if someone left it at 8 a.m. 30 years ago and has simply never needed to move it since. That's the best image I have for what Harlow Creek is like. I moved there when I was 26, which seems young in hindsight, but at the time, I had run out of the kind of ambition that requires living somewhere expensive. I had a small inheritance from my grandmother, a box of books, and a very strong desire to stop eating dinner over a kitchen sink. My sister had moved to the county seat about 40 minutes away, which meant I had a reason to visit that general part of the world. And Harlow Creek had a 2-bedroom house for rent at a price that seemed too low, which I later understood was because nobody outside of Harlow Creek particularly wanted to live in Harlow Creek. Not because it was unpleasant. That's the important thing to say first. It was actually quite pleasant. It had a main street of 2-story brick buildings with painted wood signs. It had a diner that served breakfast until 2 p.m. and closed before dinner. It had a library open 3 days a week, staffed by one woman named Dolores, who had been there since what I calculated was approximately the Eisenhower administration. It had a hardware store, a small grocery, a barber shop with a rotating pole, a post office, and a park with a bandstand that had not hosted a band in living memory, but was still repainted every spring, without fail. It had people who had lived there their entire lives, without any particular wish to leave. That last part is the most important part. I took a job at the county records office in the next town over, which meant I drove 40 minutes each way 5 days a week and spent my evenings in Harlow Creek's specific and deliberate quiet. The commute gave me time to decompress. The evenings gave me something I had not had in years, which was the feeling that a place was waiting for you to come home to it. I was happy there for a long while. Let me describe the town properly, because the strangeness only makes sense against the backdrop of how ordinary everything else seemed. Main Street ran roughly east to west, ending at a water tower on one side and a Baptist church on the other. The church had a sign out front with one of those arrangements of black plastic letters that churches use to display sermon titles or mild moral reminders. The sign had said, "For the entire first year I lived in Harlow Creek, the phrase, 'God is in the details.' I assumed they would change it eventually. They did not. It simply remained. The plastic letters faded from black to a dark gray, and eventually the period at the end fell off and was not replaced. But the message stayed. The diner was called Paulette's, though no one named Paulette had owned it for decades. The current owner was a man named Gus, who spoke in one-word sentences and made excellent hash browns and seemed mildly offended if you ordered anything from the laminated page on the back of the menu, which everyone understood to be a formality and not an actual offer. My neighbors were a retired couple to the left, who grew tomatoes in summer and watched birds in winter, and to the right a younger man named Dale, who worked road maintenance for the county and kept such regular hours that I used him as a secondary alarm clock. When his truck started at 6:15, I had exactly 12 minutes before I needed to be up. The rhythm of Harlow Creek was a living thing. I don't mean that poetically, I mean that it had a pulse you could feel if you paid attention long enough. A true daily heartbeat made of small, certain events that happened in the same order, at roughly the same time, every single day. Gus unlocked the diner at 6:45, regardless of weather. Dolores arrived at the library at 9 o'clock on her 3 open days, and could be seen through the glass front door standing at the returns desk for a full 5 minutes before she unlocked it, as if she needed to greet the books before the public arrived. The mail truck came down my street at 10:30. The bench outside the hardware store held 2 men in their 70s every weekday from approximately 2 to 4, who may or may not have been discussing things, as I never once heard them speak while walking past, but who gave every impression of participating in a rich, ongoing conversation held mostly in silence. At 5 o'clock, a dog named Clarence, who belonged to a woman 3 streets over, crossed through my backyard as part of a daily route that apparently included every backyard on the block. He did not bark. He simply passed through with the dignity of a man who has taken the same shortcut for 20 years and sees no reason to explain himself. And at 7 p.m., without exception, the streetlight in front of my house flickered once before coming on. One flicker, then steady. Every evening. I found all of this deeply comforting. For the first year, I moved through Harlow Creek like a person in a warm bath, slightly stunned by how little was being asked of me. I ate at Paulette's twice a week. I borrowed books from Dolores. I waved at the hardware store bench. I watched Clarence complete his evening rounds from my kitchen window. I drove to work, came home, made simple meals, and read until my eyes went soft. I fixed the house slowly. New curtains, a shelf in the bathroom, a coat of paint in the hallway that took me 4 weekends because I kept doing one wall at a time and stopping to drink tea on the porch. My sister visited once a month and commented each time that she could not tell if I was becoming very healthy or slightly feral. I told her those might not be opposites. I took walks in the evening. That was the main thing I did with my unscheduled hours. The town was small enough that a long walk covered most of it, but large enough that there were still corners I hadn't fully learned after a year. A side street where every house had wind chimes that produced a layered, slightly mournful sound when the weather changed. A small creek behind the park that nobody seemed to fish, but that was always clean and moving. Like a narrow lane behind the library where someone had planted sweet peas along a chain-link fence every spring for reasons no one I asked could fully explain. Everything in Harlow Creek had that quality. It had been done for a long time. It continued to be done. The reason, if anyone had ever given one, had been quietly absorbed into the fact of it. I came to love that about the town, which is why the first change was so noticeable. I want to say the word change carefully, because what I mean is something so small that most people would not have registered it at all. In any other place, what I'm about to describe would not even constitute a story. It would be an afternoon thought, mildly interesting, forgotten by dinner. But in Harlow Creek, where nothing changed, small things carried weight. It was a Wednesday in my second autumn there. I was walking my usual evening route, which took me down Maple past the hardware store, across the park, along the creek path, and back up the church side of Main Street. The light was its particular late September amber that makes old brickwork look almost warm. Leaves were beginning to move on the sidewalk. I had my hands in my jacket pockets and was doing nothing specific with my thoughts. I passed the church. The sign said something different, not dramatically different, not upside down or threatening or absurd, just different. The black plastic letters now read, "Some things stay because we keep them." I stopped walking. I read it twice. My first thought was that someone had finally changed the sign after more than a year, and that this seemed unexpectedly interesting. Thus, my second thought was that the phrasing was a little unusual for a church sign. Not wrong exactly, just slightly more philosophical than the average roadside spiritual reminder. I noted it mentally and kept walking. By the time I was home and had made tea, I had mostly forgotten it. Then the following Wednesday I passed the sign again. It said, "Some things stay because we keep them." Still the same. All right, I thought. Fair enough, they changed it once and it'll stay a while. But something about it sat differently in my chest on the second reading than the first. Not worse. Just more there somehow. Like a word you look at so long, it begins to seem strange. I mentioned it to Dolores on my next library visit, mostly to have something small to talk about. She looked up from the returns desk with the patient expression she used for most questions. "The church sign," she said. "It changed," I said. "About a month ago." She thought for a moment. "Did it?" It wasn't quite a question. "Do you know who changes it?" I asked. "Reverend or one of the deacons, I'd imagine," she said. "Do you know which one?" She considered this with more care than I expected. "No," she said at last. "I don't believe I do." That was the entirety of the conversation. But walking home, I found myself trying to remember who was responsible for small institutional tasks in Harlow Creek, and realizing I had no idea. Things happened there because they had always happened. The park bandstand got repainted. The sweet peas went in along the library fence. Dolores opened at 9 o'clock. The benches outside the hardware store were occupied at 2 o'clock. The streetlight flickered once and came on at 7 o'clock. And the church sign said what it said, for reasons I had no access to. There was no particular reason for this to bother me. And yet, the sign changed again in November. This time it said, "Not everything lost knows it has left." I stopped on the sidewalk in the cold evening air and read that 3 times. It was the kind of sentence that sounds like it means something specific without telling you what. My first feeling was that it was beautiful, in a slightly uncomfortable way. My second feeling was that a church sign was a strange place for it. I went home and tried to think of another example of a place where that sentence would feel natural and couldn't immediately settle on one. Not a memorial, not a greeting card, not a sermon, really. It had the quality of something spoken aloud in a room that had already emptied. I started paying closer attention after that. Not obsessively. I was not the kind of person who photographed signs or started spreadsheets. I just began reading it more carefully on my Wednesday walks, noting what it said, and thinking about whether it connected to what came before. In December it said, "The ones who remember outlast the ones who left." January. A place stays longer in a person than a person stays in a place. February. Some names belong to the street more than to the person. March. If you stay long enough, the leaving gets harder to picture. I started writing them down in the back of whatever notebook I happened to be using at the time, not because I thought they were sinister. Looking at them now, they still don't feel sinister. They feel like something a thoughtful person was working through slowly, using a public surface as a kind of private diary, one line at a time. That was what bothered me. They were too sequential for sermon topics, too specific for general inspiration. They read like a thought unfolding over months, a consideration of staying and leaving, belonging and loss, memory and place. The kind of thinking that has a particular direction to it. They were addressed to someone. I became fairly sure of that by spring, and I began to have the gentle, persistent, slightly irrational suspicion that they were addressed, at least in part, to me. I should tell you why that didn't feel as absurd as it sounds. Harlow Creek had a way of incorporating people. That is the only language I have for it. As people who stayed for a full cycle of seasons found that the town had made a place for them without asking permission. The mail came correctly, even if you hadn't filled out a forwarding form. Your name appeared on the community board at the library even though you had never signed anything. Gus started making your usual order when he saw your car in the lot. That last one sounds like good customer service. But Gus did not look at you while making your order. He did not nod or make eye contact. He simply turned around when you walked in, made the food, and set it on the counter, as if the sequence of your arrival and your meal had been established at a level below conversation and did not require renegotiating each time. I had, by my second year, become a kind of furniture in Harlow Creek, and I was the young woman in the house with the new curtains. I was the one who borrowed literary fiction from Dolores. I was the one who waved at the bench. I was the one who watched Clarence cross her yard at 5 o'clock. I was part of the rhythm. That felt warm. It genuinely did. But it also meant that the town had opinions about me. That sounds strange, but it is the only way to say it. Not gossip, not judgment. More like a place develops a version of you that fits its memory, and that version does not always ask what you think. This came home to me when I tried, in late spring of my second year, to change my walking route. Not dramatically. I simply wanted to go a different direction on Tuesday evenings. Down past the creek first, then up the other side of Maine, approaching the church from the east rather than the west. Larry, the first time I tried it, I turned up a street I hadn't been down before, and found a long block of older houses with deep porches and dark windows. Nothing threatening, just quiet. But halfway down the block, every porch light clicked on at the same moment, though it was not yet dark, and the whole street suddenly felt like a corridor with walls I hadn't noticed before. I felt with unusual clarity that I was not supposed to go that way. I turned back. The second time I tried a different variation and got as far as the bridge over the creek before realizing I had lost track of time. Not dramatically. The light hadn't changed. I wasn't confused or upset. Just suddenly unsure of how long I had been standing there looking at the water. When I checked my phone, 20 minutes had passed during what felt like 2. That I went home the usual way. After that, I kept my walks the same as they had always been. And I told myself that was just practical. The sign that summer was the one that made me sit down when I got home. It said, "We are glad you stayed," just that. No theological framing, no pronoun clarification about who we referred to. Just a clean, warm, slightly formal sentence. I stood in front of the church in the early evening light for a long moment. It could have been for anyone. A new family. A congregation member who had considered leaving. A general sentiment directed at the summer sky. But I had been in Harlow Creek for almost 2 years, and I had been watching these signs for the better part of 1, And by then, I knew how the town's language worked. Things there were rarely for no one. I went home and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. The signs were beautiful. They were not threatening. The town was not dangerous. Nothing had hurt me or frightened me in any acute way. The porch lights had come on. I had lost a few minutes at a bridge. I ate breakfast at the diner, and Gus knew my order. That was not a horror story. That was a Tuesday. And yet, there was something gathering at the edges of these small facts that I could not quite name. A feeling that the town was doing something with me without asking. Not maliciously, that is important. Nothing in Harlow Creek felt malicious. It felt patient, organized, like a very old piece of machinery that had been calibrated over so many decades that it no longer needed anyone to choose its direction. It simply continued. And it continued with you inside it. I decided to do something I had not done in 2 years. I decided to ask, not about the signs specifically, about the town more generally, about its history, its habits, who had made its traditions and why, whether any of this had a name that predated my noticing it. My first stop was Dolores. She was exactly where she always was, returns desk, cardigan. A library so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights thinking. I asked her how long she had worked there. 31 years, she said, without looking up. And the town, I said. Has it always been like this? She looked up then, with a careful, measuring expression. Like what? She said. Consistent, I said. She considered the word. Yes, she said. People don't leave often, I said. She went back to her returns. But some do, she said. And when they do? A pause. She aligned a stack of books without apparent effort. Things fill back in, she said. I thanked her and left with more books than I had intended to borrow. Next, I tried the bench outside the hardware store. This was, I realized as I approached, a thing I had never done before. I had waved at the bench from across the street. I had passed it. I had never sat on it or spoken to the 2 men who occupied it. Their names, I knew from oblique community board references, were Harold and Vernon. I sat at the far end of the bench and said good afternoon. Harold, who was closer to me, nodded once without turning his head. Vernon, farther down, made a small sound of acknowledgement. After a minute, I said, Have you lived here all your lives? Harold said, Yes. I waited. He said nothing else. What was it like when you were young? I asked. Harold considered this for a long time. Same, he said. The same as now? He thought again. More or less. I tried a few other questions and received patient, minimal answers. Not unfriendly. They were not cold people. They just seemed to experience conversation the same way the town experienced time, without a strong need for it to go anywhere new. Before I left, I asked one final question. The church sign, I said. Do you know who changes it? Both men were quiet for a moment. Then Harold said, Reverend's been gone a good while. I waited. The deacons handle things, he said. Which ones? I asked. Another pause. Can't say it's any one person, Vernon said, which was the most he had spoken. Nays, does the congregation decide what it says? Harold's expression changed in a small way. Not uncomfortable. More like the way someone looks when a question is interesting, but the answer is complicated. I expect it says what needs saying, he said. I walked home slowly. That evening the streetlight flickered and came on, and I stood on the porch watching it until the dark settled completely over the street. The next part is harder to explain, without sounding more alarmed than I actually felt. I began checking old photographs, not from any obsession with proof, just curiosity with direction. I had a photo album from my first month in Harlow Creek, taken when everything was still new enough to document. Street corners, the diner window, the park, the church sign with its original message about God and details. I pulled it out one evening and sat at the kitchen table with tea and went through it slowly. Main Street looked the same. Of course it did. The hardware store looked the same. The bench was visible in one corner of a photo, empty, but positioned exactly where Harold and Vernon sat every afternoon. The church sign said, God is in the details. And in the background of 2 different photos, on 2 separate streets taken weeks apart, there was the same figure. I do not want to overdramatize this. It was a person standing at a distance, not looking at the camera, wearing a dark coat. In the first photo, they were at the far end of the park. In the second, They were halfway down the street that I had turned back from, the one with the porch lights. In both photos, they were roughly the same distance away, the same posture, all upright and still, facing slightly away. Not sinister in the image itself. People stand on streets. But I had taken those photos weeks apart, and I had no memory of the figure, and I had never seen that particular dark coat on anyone I knew in town. I went through the album again more carefully. The figure appeared in 4 photos in total, always at a distance, always slightly outside whatever I had been looking at when I pressed the button. Never the subject, just present in the margins. I slept fine that night. I want to be clear about that. But I thought about it a long time before sleeping. The climax, if I call it that, happened on a Saturday in September of my 3rd year. I say climax, but it was not dramatic. It was one of the quietest events of my life in Harlow Creek. That almost made it harder. I had been to the grocery and come home and was putting things away in the kitchen when I noticed that the church sign was visible from my kitchen window if I stood at a particular angle near the sink. I had not noticed this before, though I had lived in that house for 3 years. From the window, at the right angle, I could read the letters. The sign had changed the night before. I had seen it on my walk. It said, "Stay, you already belong here." I stood at the window for a while. Then I did something I had never done in 3 years. I walked to the church, not on my usual route, directly. Down my street 2 blocks east, past the barbershop and the post office to the front of the building. It was mid-morning on a Saturday. The street was quiet. The building itself was old brick with narrow pointed windows and a simple wooden door. The kind of church you see in small towns everywhere, distinguished mostly by its persistence. The front door was unlocked. Inside it was cool and dim and smelled of old wood and a faint floral mustiness from some decades of dried flowers. The pews were unoccupied. The light through the colored glass in the side windows cast patterns on the floor. It was very quiet in the particular way of old buildings that have absorbed a lot of silence over a long time. I sat in the back pew. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Permission, maybe. Some evidence of the ordinary machinery behind all the small, extraordinary consistencies of Harlow Creek. After a few minutes, a door at the front of the sanctuary opened and an older woman came through it. Not elderly, maybe 65. Silver hair, plain clothes, a calm face. She moved without hurry and without surprise at finding me there. She sat in the pew across the aisle from mine and folded her hands. "You walk past on Wednesdays," she said. "I do," I said. "You've been reading the sign?" "Yes." She nodded. I asked who wrote the messages. She was quiet for a moment, in the Harlow Creek way that means consideration rather than avoidance. "Different people over the years," she said. "Whoever has something that needs saying." "The current messages," I said. "The ones about staying and belonging." "Yes," she said. "Did someone specific write them?" She looked at me with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply direct. "We noticed you were trying to figure it out," she said. "Yes, we thought it better to say it plainly." I sat with that for a moment. "How long have you been watching?" I asked. "We don't watch," she said carefully. "We notice. There's a difference." I asked what the difference was. She thought about it. "Watching is waiting for something to happen," she said. "Noticing is knowing something already has." I asked what had already happened. She said, "You stayed." As if that was sufficient. As if staying in Harlow Creek was not just a choice but an event, something that had occurred and been recorded and now had consequences. I asked what consequences. She said, "The town keeps what it knows." The air in the church was very still. Light moved across the floor in a slow rectangle as a cloud passed outside. The wood of the pew was smooth under my hands in the way of things touched by many people over a long time. I asked, as calmly as I could, whether people who stayed in Harlow Creek could also leave. She considered this longer than I expected. "Of course," she said, and then, after a pause, "Most do." I waited. She did not add anything to that. I thanked her, which felt like the right thing to do, and left the church and walked home on the most direct route available. Clarence was crossing my backyard when I arrived, right on time, 5 p.m., as always. I watched him from the back porch and tried to decide what I had just been told. The aftermath was mostly internal, which I think is true of the strangest things that happened to us. Nothing in Harlow Creek changed after that conversation. And the sign changed once more before the end of the year. It said, "We keep the ones who know us." Gus still made my order without eye contact. Dolores still opened at 9 o'clock. Harold and Vernon sat from 2 to 4. Clarence still crossed my yard at 5. The streetlight still flickered once at 7 and then held steady. The figure in the dark coat appeared once more, that winter, at the end of my usual walking route, standing at the far edge of the park near the bandstand. Just present as before, facing slightly away. I watched for a minute, then kept walking. It did not follow. By the time I circled back, it was gone. I never looked at it as a threat, more like a reminder that some things in Harlow Creek had standing, that the town held a record of itself and of the people who had moved through it, and that standing at a distance was simply one of the ways it let you know the record existed. I stayed for another year after that conversation. Then circumstances, real and practical ones, work, family, a relationship that required me to be in a different place, pulled me away in a way that felt both necessary and slightly false. Moving out of Harlow Creek was one of the more peculiar experiences of my life. Not because anything resisted exactly. The boxes went into the van. My neighbor waved from her garden. Dale's truck was in the driveway. Clarence did his 5 o'clock crossing without looking at me differently. But the morning I left, the church sign said, "What is known is not forgotten." And the streetlight in front of my house came on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour and a half before sunset, and stayed on until I drove away. And I looked at it in the rearview mirror for a long time. I think about Harlow Creek more than I expected to, not with dread. That's the important thing to say. The town was not cruel. It was not predatory. If it was strange in the way that very old stable places sometimes are, places that have been held together by the same habits for so long that those habits have developed a kind of weight, a gravity, and the things and people inside them orbit at predictable distances without having chosen to. It was comfortable there. It felt like being known, which is a thing most people want more than they admit. But it also felt like being filed, documented, cataloged, given a place in a record that preceded me by decades and would outlast me by more. And I think the thing I understood, very slowly over those 3 years, was that the town wasn't doing this to me specifically. It wasn't personal in the way the churchwoman made it sound. It was just what Harlow Creek did, what it had always done, what it would continue doing with whoever moved into my house after I left. The town kept what it knew. That was simply its nature. I drove back through Harlow Creek once, about a year after leaving. I told myself it was because I was passing through that part of the county anyway, which was almost true. The drive down Main Street was exactly as I remembered it. Gus's diner, library, hardware store, bench. The bench held 2 older men. I did not recognize either of them. They were not Harold or Vernon. I slowed the car as I passed, and one of them, the closer one, lifted a hand in the same easy wave I had offered for 3 years. They aimed directly at my car, without, from what I could see, any particular recognition. Just the gesture, automatic, built into the routine of that bench on that street. The church sign, as I passed, said, "Everyone who stays adds to the keeping." I did not stop. I drove on through town and out the other side where the fields open up and the sky gets wider. But I thought about it for the rest of that drive, and still think about it now. The men on the bench were different. The sign was the same. The wave still happened. There is something in that pattern I have never fully worked out. Whether the town's memory lives in its people specifically or somewhere behind them. In the streets themselves, in the habits and the rhythms, in the sign and the light and the dog crossing the yard at exactly 5 o'clock. Whether it matters who does the keeping, as long as the keeping continues. Whether staying in a place long enough gives it something of you that remains after you have gone. Some small, permanent addition to whatever it already was, too quiet to see directly, but woven in nonetheless. I don't know. What I know is that sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I have been lying still for a long time, I find myself listening for a streetlight, for a flicker, then a steady glow, for the reliable small pulse of a place that knows exactly what time it is, and what day, and who has passed through it, and who has stayed, and who is lying awake somewhere beyond its edges, still listening for the sound of it. And some nights, I almost think I can hear it. The town goes on. It keeps what it knows. And somewhere in what it knows, I think, is still a version of me standing at the kitchen window at a particular angle, reading a message I was never entirely sure was meant for someone else.